Right, here we go. This is reading number 3 of Neil Gaiman's book, The Graveyard Book. In our last reading, a baby boy, who eventually, I guess, grows up to be this guy here, escaped the murder of the rest of his family, who are now all dead, by crawling into a graveyard, where he was rescued by a pair of ghosts, Mr. and Mrs. Owens, and with the help of this mysterious chap here, who we don't know whether he's dead or not yet, Mr. Silas. The ghosts, however, about 300 of them who live in the graveyard, are now discussing what is to be done with the young boy who is being christened by the ghosts Nobody Owens. Mrs. Owens, the ghost, is cradling the baby outside the chapel whilst the rest of the ghosts discuss what is to be done. Mrs. Owens waited outside the chapel. It had been decreed, which means decided by someone in power, over 40 years before, that the building, in appearance a small church with a spire, was a listed building of historical interest. The town council had decided that it would cost too much to renovate it, a little chapel in an overgrown graveyard that had already become unfashionable. So they had padlocked it and waited for it to fall down. Ivy covered it, but it was solidly built and would not fall down this century. The child had fallen asleep in Mrs. Owens' arms. She rocked it gently, sang to it an old song, one her mother had sung to her when she was a baby herself, back in the days when men had first started to wear powdered wigs. The song went, "Sleep, my little baby, oh, sleep until you waken. When you're grown, you'll see the world, if I am not mistaken. Kiss a lover, dance a measure, find your name and buried treasure." And Mrs. Owens sang all that before she discovered that she'd forgotten how the song had ended. She had a feeling that the final line had something in the way of, "and some hairy bacon." But that might have been another song altogether, so she stopped. And instead, she sang him the one about the man in the moon who came down too soon. And after that, she sang in her warm country voice a more recent song about a lad who had put his thumb and pulled out a plum. And she had just started a long ballad about a young country gentleman whose girlfriend had, for no particular reason, poisoned him with a dish of spotted eels, when Silas came round the side of the chapel carrying a cardboard box. "Here we go, Mistress Owens," he said. "Lots of good things for a growing boy. We can keep it in the crypt, eh?" The padlock fell off in his hand, and he pulled open the iron door to the crypt. Mrs. Owens walked inside, looking dubiously, as if she's not sure what she's looking at the shelves, and at the old wooden pews tipped up against the wall. There were mildewed boxes of old parish records in one corner, and an open door that revealed a Victorian flush toilet and a basin with only a cold tap in the other. The infant opened his eyes and stared. "We could put the food here," said Silas. "It's cool and the food will keep longer." He reached into the box, pulled out a banana. "And what would that be when it's at home?" asked Mrs. Owens, eyeing the yellow and brown object suspiciously. "It's a banana, a fruit from the tropics. I believe you peel off the outer covering," said Silas, "like so." The child, Nobody, wriggled in Mrs. Owens' arms, and she let it down onto the flagstones. It toddled rapidly to Silas, grasped his trowel legs, and held on. Silas passed it the banana. Mrs. Owens watched the boy eat. "Banana," she said. And Mrs. Owens has been dead for a few hundred years and probably never saw a banana. Dubiously, "Never heard of them. Never. What's it taste like?" "I've absolutely no idea," said Silas, who consumed only one food, and it was not bananas. "You could make up a bed in here for the boy, you know." "I'll do no such thing with Owens and me having a lovely little tomb over by the dread daffodil patch. Plenty of room in there for a little one. Anyway," she added, concerned that Silas might think she was rejecting his hospitality, "I wouldn't want the lad disturbing you." He wouldn't. The boy had finished his banana. What he had not eaten was now smeared over himself. He beamed messily and apple-cheeked. "Nah," he said happily. "Oh, what a clever little thing he is," said Mrs. Owens. "And such a mess he's made. Why, attend you little wriggler." And she picked the lumps of banana from his clothes and his hair, and then she said, "What do you think they'll decide?" "I don't know." "I can't give him up, not after what I promised his mamma." "Although I have been a great many things in my time," said Silas, I have never been a mother, and I do not plan to begin now. But I can leave this place. Mrs. Owen said simply, I cannot. My bones are here, and so are Owens's. I'm never leaving. It must be good, said Silas, to have somewhere that you belong. Somewhere that's home. There was nothing wistful in the way he said this. His voice was drier than a desert, and he had said it as if he were simply stating something unarguable. Mrs. Owens did not argue. Do you think we'll have to wait long? Not long, said Silas, but he was wrong about that. Up in the amphitheatre, on the other side of the hill, where the ghosts are discussing what to be doing with nobody, the debate continued. That it was the Owenses who had got involved in this nonsense, rather than some flibbity-gibbet Johnny-come-latelys, counted for a lot, for the Owenses were respectable and respected. That Silas had volunteered to be the boy's guardian had weight. Silas was regarded with a certain wary awe, or by the graveyard folk, existing as he did on the borderland between their world and the world they had left. But still. A graveyard is not normally a democracy. That means a place where everyone has a vote and the same. And yet death is the great democracy, and each of the dead had a voice and an opinion as to whether the living child should be allowed to stay, and they were each determined to be heard that night. It was late autumn when the daybreak was long in coming. Although the sky was still dark, cars could now be heard starting further down the hill, and as the living folk began to drive to work through the misty night black morning, the graveyard folk still talked about the child that had come to them and what was to be done. 300 voices, 300 opinions. Nehemiah Trott, the poet, from the tumbled northwestern side of the graveyard, had begun to declaim his opinion, although what it was, no person listening could have said, when something happened. Something to silence each opinionated mouth. Something unprecedented in the history of the graveyard. A huge white horse, of the kind that people who knew horses would call a grey, came ambling, that means walking kind of casually, up to the side of the hill. The pounding of its hooves could be heard before it was seen, along with the crashing it made as it pushed through the little bushes and thickets, through the brambles and the ivy and the gorse that had grown up on the side of the hill. The size of a shire horse it was, a full 19 hands or more. It was a horse that could have carried a knight in full armour into combat, and all it carried on its naked back was a woman, clothed from head to foot in grey. Her long skirt and her shawl might have been spun out of old cobwebs. Her face was serene and peaceful. They knew her, the graveyard folk, for each of us encounters the lady on the grey at the end of our days, and there is no forgetting her. In some mythology, Lady in the Grey, I think, is often an alternative to the Grim Reaper. She is the bringer of death. The horse paused beside the obelisk, the large statue. In the east, the sky was lightening gently, a pearlish pre-dawn luminescence or glow that made the people of the graveyard uneasy and made them think about returning to their comfortable homes. Even so, not one of them moved. They were watching the lady on the grey, each of them half excited, half scared. The dead are not superstitious, not as a rule. But they watched her as a Roman augur might have watched the sacred crows circle, seeking wisdom, seeking a clue. And she spoke to them. In a voice like the chiming of 100 tiny silver bells, she said only, "The dead should have charity." And she smiled. The horse, which had been contentedly ripping up and masticating or chewing on a clump of thick grass, stopped then. The lady touched its neck, and it turned. It took several huge clattering steps. Then it was off the side of the hill and cantering across the sky. Its thunderous hooves became an early rumble of distant thunder, and in moments it was lost to sight. That at least was what the folk of the graveyard, who had been on the hillside that night, claimed had happened. The debate was over and ended, and without so much as a show of hands had been decided. The child, called Nobody Owens, would be given the freedom of the graveyard. Mother Slaughter and Josiah Worthington, Bard, accompanied Mr. Owens to the crypt of the old chapel, and they told Mrs. Owens the news. She seemed unsurprised by the miracle. "That's right," she said. "Some of them don't have a ha'porth of sense in their head, but she does." Of course she does. Before the sun rose on a stormy grey morning, the child was fast asleep in the Owens' fine little tomb. For Master Owens had died the prosperous head of the local cabinet makers' guild, and the cabinet makers had wanted to ensure that he was properly honoured. Silas went out for one final journey before sunrise. He found the tall house on the side of the hill, and he examined the 3 bodies he found there, and he studied the pattern of the knife wounds. When he was satisfied, he stepped out into the morning's dark, his head churning with unpleasant possibilities. And he returned to the graveyard, to the chapel spire where he slept, and waited for the days. Waited out the days. In a little town at the bottom of the hill, the man Jack was getting increasingly angry. He's the man who killed the family and was hunting for the boy. The night had been one that he'd been looking forward to for so long, the culmination of months, of years of work. And the business of the evening had started so promisingly. 3 people down before any of them even had a chance to cry out, and then it all gone so maddeningly wrong. Why on earth had he gone up the hill when the child was so obviously gone down the hill? Quick pause. Remember, Silas had tricked him into thinking the baby was not in the graveyard when he really was. By the time he had reached the bottom of the hill, the trail had gone cold. Someone must have found the child, taken it in and hidden it. There was no other explanation. A crack of thunder rang out, loud and sudden as a gunshot, and the rain began in earnest. The man Jack was methodical, and he began to plan his next move. The calls he would need to pay on certain of the townsfolk, people who would be his eyes and ears in the town. He did not need to tell the convocation he had failed. We don't know what the convocation is yet. Anyway, he told himself, edging under a shop front as the morning rain came down like tears. He had not failed, not yet, not for years to come. There was plenty of time. Time to tie up this last piece of unfinished business. Time to cut that final thread. It was not until the police sirens sounded, and first a police car, then an ambulance, and then an unmarked police car with a siren blaring sped past them on their way up the hill that, reluctantly, the man Jack turned up the collar of his coat, put his head down and walked off into the morning. His knife was in his pocket, safe and dry inside its sheath case, protected from the misery of the elements. I'm trying to work out what's going on with Silas. He can come and go from the graveyard. We know he's not alive nor dead, and he can make people change their mind. I wonder what kind of person he is. Maybe we'll find out tomorrow.